Yeah, so we're going to have Megan Samford, who is on our advisory council, leading a panel to talk about how to conduct security assessments on critical infrastructure. Most of us are used to having all these conversations, and we don't even realize we're only talking about a fraction of the world, just the typical enterprise IT stuff. You know, the desktops, the laptops, the servers that are in your office environment, completely missing the fact that most of this world is running on industrial control systems, which supports our critical infrastructure. And by the way, those enterprise IT environments, they kind of need the power, the cooling, the water to run. Running an assessment on them isn't so simple. So we've got Megan here, who is the Chief Product Security Officer at Schneider Electric, to lead a conversation on how we can navigate that.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bryson. And thanks for everyone for having us today and inviting us to conduct this conversation with you all. So as Bryson said, I'm Megan Sanford. I'm the Vice President, Chief Product Security Officer for the energy management side of the house and Schneider Electric. If you're a customer, or if we interact with you all, that's the side of the house that I cover. My counterpart, Andy Kling, who speaks at a ton of conferences, he's great. He covers the industrial automation side of the house. And then Klaus Jekyll is actually our Chief Product Security Officer that covers the whole company. So that's a little bit of background on my current role. Prior to coming to Schneider Electric, I led product security and product safety for Rockwell Automation. And prior to that, I was actually at General Electric, where I met two of our fabulous panel members today, Corey Jackson, as well as Jake Kamieniak. So Corey, if you don't mind, I'd like to pass it over to you to do your introduction first, and then Jake, and then we'll round it out with Brian Wisniewski, who I worked for at Rockwell Automation.
Very good. So Corey Jackson, physically and geographically in Dallas, Texas area, about 25 years in the cybersecurity domain. First started out in the federal government, doing traditional IT security, various facets for FBI, IRS, and State Department. Transitioned over to General Electric, where I started our product security incident response team, and that role involved into running our software and product security COE, where we conducted security assessments, not only on web-based applications, mobile, but also embedded products, which many are used within critical infrastructure. Then moved on in various CISO roles for a couple of Fortune 200 companies, and now run my own consultant advisory company, SACRO LLC.
Thanks, Corey.
Mm-hmm.
Jake?
All right. Hi, I'm Jacob Kaminiak. I'm currently a red teamer at General Electric. I actually got my start in the cybersecurity industry working for Corey here, so it's kind of nice feels like being back on the same team. But my background started with both like IT and enterprise penetration testing, but also doing vulnerability assessments and like bug finding on products and industrial control systems. Since then, I've done a variety of other offensive security roles at General Electric, working with some of the scanning operations, scanning and patching, and now finally over on the red team, where we do like long-term adversary emulation work, including some that touches on OT environments.
Great, thank you, Jake. Brian? I don't know, I can't hear Brian. Can anyone else?
Uh-oh, how's that?
There we go.
Much better.
Yeah, that's better, thank you. Maybe speak up a little bit.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Brian Wisniewski. I'm a cyber operations officer with the Army Reserve Innovation Command, and we basically serve as a subject matter expert repository for folks supporting Army Futures Command and the Department of Defense. One thing I as you know, I have to provide a disclaimer up front. Any views or opinions expressed today are strictly my own personal ones, not those of the Army, Army Reserve, DoD, or U.S. government. So very glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. So the audience can tell that we have a wide breadth of experience here and depth of the knowledge, especially with Jake being a current red teamer, Corey having pretty much done all of this in the past 20 years, from governance, risk, and compliance work to running red teams, running blue teams, and Brian here is doing this today in a few different capacities. So we'll go ahead and get the panel kicked off. So the first question, when we talk generally about the subject of security assessments on critical infrastructures, we're considering both the traditional enterprise network, the physical security of the asset, as well as the operational technology environment. Can you describe what you truly consider the nuances or the differences when you go to jump the enterprise network and go into doing an assessment on the OT side of the house? Can it be automated in the same way? What has been your experience? What have been some concerns that were definitely brought up in the process? And what generally would you say defines this space as being, in my mind, kind of a I won't say scary, maybe that's not the appropriate word, but this is definitely an area of heightened sensitivity, and I don't think that there's a lot of clarity when it comes to performing assessments on critical infrastructures today. Who wants to start off?
I'll tee it up from the enterprise side and I'll pass it off. I think that, can it be automated? Yes. Is it the best thing to do? The verdict's still out. I think as I compare IT environments to OT environments, the IT space, security testing has become very commoditized. There are more off-the-shelf tools. There's now more, even if you dabble in the cloud, a lot of the cloud providers are now offering automation. So security assessment and testing is a bit more turnkey on the IT side. When it goes to OT, I think if it's critical infrastructure or OT related to a manufacturing company, there's still a lot of fear of testing and taking down equipment. One, because of life safety, and two, because maybe you're going to stop product from going out the door. And I think that's where I spend most time having my conversation about those trade-offs versus the reality of, do we really need to test our environment, OT, and how can we best do so?
No, I absolutely agree. Brian, what's been your experience? I would imagine that this is an area that's top of mind in a few different areas.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I'd certainly echo Corey's observations. There's still concern about stepping into the OT space, but we're finding more and more familiarity with it. You're seeing OT products using more commercial or more IT type protocols, more approaches that way. And I think the other benefit I think we've seen in probably the past 5 or 10 years is stepping back more to the development side. We're seeing products where this has been designed in from the beginning. It's actually been included as part of the design. They're doing more testing with things like IEC 62443, the international standard for industrial automation. You're seeing that all the way from the product development, secure development lifecycle side, certification of the products, the integration in a certain way so that it fits and it's operated in a secure way, all the way through the asset management side and the decommissioning. So I think what we're seeing is an evolution across the board, and more the example of SolarWinds is probably going back to the supply chain risk management side, where we're seeing, again, they're finding the vulnerabilities in the infrastructure and they're taking advantage of that. And that's something that I think you're going to see more efforts in the federal acquisition space in particular, they're taking steps to make sure that's addressed.
Great. Jake?
I'm not sure I have a ton to add. Both of you covered, I think, the main points of it. Like, from when I've been in a position to scope these kinds of engagements, or when somebody has approached us to ask for an OT engagement, we've definitely seen executives ask for do red teaming in OT environments, and usually we have to walk that back and ask, well, what do you actually mean? What are you actually trying to get out of the test? Because you do have to bring more caution into an environment, because an OT environment, because the trust boundaries are different. So yeah.
And I'll interject a question. I think Brian is spot on with a lot of the new next gen technology that's coming out, having security embedded in there, being tested thoroughly by the product owner. But I guess too, and this is, I guess I'm supposed to be moderating, so I shouldn't throw a question out there, but it's for you, Jake. I guess what do you see in light of that as it relates to legacy assets that are out there. Because even if you want to do automation, can they even handle the automation to be tested as well as deliver the capability they're designed for?
Do you mean like legacy IT or legacy like?
Or just legacy ICS equipment OT that just was never meant to be connected to the internet?
Right. And I think of it like I've seen some of the research on people who do like car hacking, and some of the stuff where they like do that, they get like in the wires that control the parts of the car. And you can imagine when the engineer was building this, they were like, well, obviously if you connect directly to this stuff and send it, you know, a high voltage or I don't know, whatever controls it, Modbus stuff, right? Then it'll behave in a certain way. And PLCs are the same way, right? They're supposed to just be the kind of like the fancy chip that controls something that moves. And that's what I meant about trust boundaries. So I think that this kind of bleeds over into another question I know you were planning on asking, Megan, but I'm getting to it too early, which is that like we try to do a lot more closer to white box testing in these cases, because you can do offensive testing in OT environments. You just have to plan and account for your risks.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's absolutely right. And when we, you know, if I were to try to generalize the scoping of the threat for purposes of today's conversation on how do you conduct assessments into OT environments, well, number one, we conduct assessments because we're trying to anticipate susceptibility of an environment to a certain threat, right? And we want to understand how that risk propagates through the state machine, and as it does, what are really the beachhead products, if you will, where we can begin to control that risk. So if we take ransomware for an example, that is an area that has been hitting OT environments hard. And in my mind, it's hitting the OT environments hard because the risk is not, it's very difficult to measure. And once you measure it, it's very difficult to find all the open doors in OT environments. For example, how could I, if WannaCry hit, you know, if we were to go backwards in time, and I'm responsible for the protection of an OT environment, and I'm trying to anticipate where these open doors are, there has not been an effective kind of automated way to discover where the open doors are so that you could shut them in advance. That's been my at least my experience. And so with OT, it's like you have this high degree of susceptibility because many asset owners don't know what products they have. They don't have an accurate inventory, and you can't control what you don't know about, right? So I do think that we're seeing an emergence of technologies that are trying to solve for this problem, right? Platforms that want to uncover the asset inventories as well as the open doors, right? In terms of doing that in an automated way, it gets into the discussion on passive versus active scanning, right? So any comment or observations around that?
I agree with that. I think that, you know, again, OT originally was never designed to be connected to the internet. And some of those doors you spoke of that we don't know about were purposely meant to stay open. If it's for remote diagnosis, monitoring, or even a lot of the product owners built those doors so they can remote in and do patching, non-security related. So you're almost redesigning, re-architecting those products, which we're starting to see happen now. But again, the products out in the environment are 20 years old and sometimes older. So again, it's just that, you know, trying to take today's security to fix yesterday's problem as we plan for yesteryear, if that makes sense. But it's a mixed bag of solutions. You just have to kind of get a little lucky and then pull the right skills together.
That's right.
And one thing, kind of to Jacob's point about that, the trust boundary, I think it was last summer or maybe fall, the DHS CISA, that was a joint announcement or an alert between NSA and CISA where they walked through. And again, remote access was one of those key parameters that they could point to as a common denominator in this kind of a challenge. So yeah, I think, you know, that the assumption made when these were designed decades ago was that remote access was going to be a great thing, reduce labor costs, you know, allow greater uptime. They didn't understand it from the threat environment we have today.
I mean, we've seen hard-coded passwords in the software and the password printed in the sales manual that went to the controller. So you're talking about giving the keys to the kingdom there.
Absolutely.
That's very true. I remember quite a bit of those manuals have ended up online, right?
Yes.
So that brings me to another question. Actually, we're kind of tiptoeing around it. Is what is your understanding of an air gap? What is this mythical unicorn that supposedly exists within OT environments? Can you all each give me an interpretation of air gap? And if you think it's a security, if it's real, or if it's more of what I call like a truism, right? Like we believe these things to be true.
I love this question because every time I hear people use the phrase air gap, they're not doing what I would consider an air gap. Generally, when I hear somebody say their environment is air gapped, they are talking about VPN access into their environment, and it just makes me kind of like shrivel up a little bit and be like, oh, it's not what you think it is. The purpose of an air gap is that, somebody would have to, in my mind, like physically move to another location with a network that they can then maybe from their new seat that's on the inside of the air gap network VPN into whatever place they need to like manage their OT stuff. I think this ties back with some of the previous discussion about management and remote access, because people need to manage their devices. And there really isn't a reason why you shouldn't or can't use remote management tools if you do it in a way that's secure. But letting somebody VPN in from anywhere in the world, I think that's asking for trouble.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think from where I sit, does air gap exist? Yes. I mean, I've seen it in IT environments, probably more so on the classified side of the house, so you can clearly air gap systems. When it comes to a company that has heavy IT, OT interdependencies and convergence, I normally don't see that. And even if they have the great architect is firewalled off, I've still seen instances. I still feel if someone can walk in and place a USB into a system to execute something, then it's still not air gap, which opens up data. And then, like I mentioned earlier, just having those data feeds for data collections, monitoring metrics, et cetera, it's not air gapped. If it's sending outbound data, you can definitely go inbound.
Yeah, 100%.
And yeah, Corey, to echo your comments, even, I think, Jacob, you had brought up the asset inventory. I think it goes back to understanding if you don't have control of that, if you don't know what's connecting to your environment, what's in your environment, I think air gap as a concept is good. It's rarely implemented in that way. And even along those lines, some of the most secure facilities out there, in previous organizations I've worked with, when we had penetration testers, they would come in for the assessment and the assertion was made, you'll never get in here, and they're like, well, if someone smokes in this building, we'll be in. And sure enough, always proved true.
And air gaps can be defeated.
I love it. Can you repeat that? If someone smokes in this building, we'll get in.
Because if it's in the middle of winter, they're not going to go all the way out where they're supposed to in certain areas, and they'll just prop something open. And absolutely,
totally. Brian, this reminds me. So I'm going to pull on this thread a little bit. So when we're talking about the product inventory, we're talking about different capabilities that people want from time to time, remote access. Then we segue to what about the air gap? Talk to me a little bit about change control in these environments. Is it different than IT? I mean, when I think of change control, I believe it's more of a precise process in OT, but there's also more room for error because you don't maybe have things like a centralized CMDB, right? So would it beg the question that you may want to consider assessing your OT environment more often when it comes from a security assessment standpoint, because the change control has a severe impact, and it's more difficult to measure the cascading impacts, right?
Well, and I think too, from that perspective, it goes back to the asset inventory. If you don't have the CMDB, if you're not tracking those configuration changes, and you don't have a governance process in place at some level, at the engineering level, to keep things moving, to keep it operating, absolutely, they will. The engineers will make sure it is up and running. But these are software-intensive systems that are in place, and so understanding the provenance of that software, any updates, patches, things that came in. You could point back to shell shock or heartbleed as examples of something that came out of left field that wasn't expected. But yeah, for change control overall, if there's no governance process in place, that's absolutely something that would be recommended.
Yeah, I think too, the well, in absence of a good, solid asset management solution, I think there's less loyalty to brand in the OT space. And what I mean by that, on the IT side, if I'm a Microsoft shop or a Cisco shop, I'm that until I die or the next big contract change. On the OT side, you're gonna have a medley. I may have some Schneider, I may have some GE, and then you're trying to figure out how best when to pull the levers, because this one I need to do when we shut down for maintenance, be the update or we switch over new equipment. I need boots on ground for this one. This one I can do over the air. And that's just, like 20 balls you're juggling to try to simplify a common process on change control, be it an update or swapping out equipment.
If I can make an argument here, though, I think that this lack of understanding of our own environments is sometimes why you see people say that they don't want to do certain kinds of offensive testing. But the purpose of offensive testing is to validate assumptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue the opposite. I would say if you don't know what's going on, you need to do some sort of testing even more. I don't mean by that you should go in and have an inexperienced group of hackers who've never touched OT stuff before, like just play around. No, but you definitely need to start doing exercises to try to validate your assumptions about what's on your network, like doing that passive recon.
Yeah. But very true. If you don't do it proactively, an incident will
happen for you. Yeah.
All that from PCERT activities.
No doubt about it. And incident response in the OT environment, I see, and maybe this is me more making a statement for you all to react to than asking a question, but it's the lack of the proactive testing and the prevention in the OT environments that leads to the responses. And I can tell you that response in an OT environment is going to cost you a lot more, right? It's truly one of these things where, the prevention would have taken your dollar so much further.
Absolutely. Agreed.
So go ahead.
I was going to say, so I think being the eternal optimist, I do think we're seeing steps in that direction from a federal acquisition space. Again, the CMMC certification for suppliers and vendors and things. So we're focusing on that. They're using NIST 800-161 for supply chain risk management assessments and things. There's the new public-private partnership, the NCIOSC, I think it's called, that's out of Huntsville, Alabama. Again, that's more focus on the defense industrial base, but they're helping do those proactive assessments. They're providing a collective expertise to kind of do that type of thing. So the struggles that IT went through, say, 2 decades ago, 25 years ago or so, where it was sort of plug and play, bring whatever you had. I think we're starting to see that emerge. So as the eternal optimist, I think we're heading in the right direction. It's just going to take a while to get there with the life cycle on this stuff.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. So what do you all think is around the corner? I mean, if we were to kind of pontificate and make some predictions about what does security testing look like in the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years in OT environments, are we going to finally, cross this great divide? What do you think it's going to take? Where do you think you're going to see the first initial comfort level? Is it going to be at kind of the traditional Purdue level, level 4 and 5, right? Where you have those boundaries, you have those DMZs that are separating into the enterprise, right? We are seeing some threats creep over from the enterprise into the OT, and vice versa. Is that where the work starts? And just for the audience, if you Google or if you hear people talking about the Purdue model, it's really kind of the Rosetta Stone that folks use in OT to describe what layer assets are talking to one another at, and what layer you have devices that are human machine interfaces that are pulling in tons of data and showing an operator or user interface so they can see what's going on, right down to kind of the level 1, which is sensor level, meaning that you have a sensor touching a piece of big iron equipment and it's pulling data off of there. So that's how the Purdue model is used to kind of frame these conversations so people know at what level you're talking about doing something to the environment. What level do we anticipate this type of work occurring?
That's a good question. I think
you've stumped us, Megan.
I
don't know. I don't know what the future holds.
That would be impossible.
I think if we were to step back and look at even beyond just sort of the technical side, but from an organization perspective, we're seeing more discussions again around the components that are used, whether it's software, firmware, hardware that are included sort of in these systems as they're being built, they're being tested and verified, validated and things. You're also seeing more efforts around supplier qualification, around vetting the either the contractors, subcontractors, and things like that. Software provenance, again, going back through that. So you're seeing that in addition to training and awareness for not just your engineers, but your procurement professionals, the quality assessment folks. You're kind of seeing that grow. I'd throw in insider threat programs in there as well. So you're seeing organizations address this holistically. I don't know that I've got an answer directly for the Purdue model where it's happening. But I do think we're seeing this kind of across the board, and there's initiatives in each of those areas, including cyber threat intelligence, including the defense of the networks, things like that, public-private partnerships. So I think we're moving in the right direction. I think I'm also a big proponent of holding those accountable for some of the most egregious incidents. We're seeing that whether through indictment or conviction, even if it never brings a conviction. The fact that we've indicted some folks, that's gonna force them to think twice about what they're doing. I think it was last week or week before, they just U.S. attorneys indicted that gentleman from Kansas for he was messing around in Ellsworth County's water system, that kind of thing. I think that rule of law is what we're based on, and establishing that and continuing to reinforce that, I think is helpful.
Yeah, the trend that I see, one's a no-brainer. I think the OT technical landscape will continue to grow and evolve. It will become more IT dependent, so that threat landscape widens. And the other trend I see, which is not a good one, but a reality, most critical infrastructure, I should say most, a fair amount of critical infrastructure is manned by government entity or government contractor. And what I see, even with the group I'm consulting now, at the county, state, and municipality level, the individuals just do not have the skill set. They don't have the skill set, and if they do have the skill set, they normally don't have the funding. Security is always a bolt-on or afterthought. So again, it's becoming a larger problem potentially with less people qualified. And I know that's always a thing. We need more people that's trained. However, we can find those people, but even from something simple as a contract, that type of support is not being written into the contract from a technical support or even how to structure it to be ready to respond to an incident. And that's the trap we continue to fall into.
That's completely true. Completely true. And on the subject of, there's multiple incentives, right? Or non-incentives that can be put into play as it pertains to critical infrastructures. I saw, it was a few months ago, and I don't know how many people caught this, but I thought it was pretty surprising that the U.S. Department of Treasury said that it was going to move towards fining critical infrastructures that paid ransom on ransomware. So say your critical infrastructure, you've got a production line going, you get hit with ransomware. You may, at that point in time, it may be very tempting for you just to pay the ransom. If the ransomware is opportunistic, it doesn't know what it has until it has something, right? That say the ransom is, $10,000, $50,000. In some cases, from a financial standpoint, you may say cost-benefit trade-off, it's going to cost me $1 million to wipe the system and restore to a gold disk working across 20 different vendors. So maybe I should just pay the ransom. And so I think it was an interesting move that we saw by U.S. Department of Treasury in making that statement, because it's a perverse incentive to perpetuate bad security practices, right?
Too, it's like fear-based management. It's like, if you have a breach, ransomware, and it impacts critical infrastructure, we're going to fine you. Okay, great. What I would love to hear is we're going to fine you $200,000, and then that money goes into some type of stewardship fund to go back and correct those problems. Where does the money go? Who knows? But, it's like, me being fined is probably the least of our worries versus let's really understand how do we make security better. And it's one of those knee-jerk type things, I think, from being in a position to say, hey, we're being accountable, we're being responsible, we're going to fine you. And I think that's why a lot of organizations are becoming very numb to bad security or breaches, because now they can buy their way out of it, either by their own pockets or cyber insurance. And I kind of was going to mention this earlier too with the trends. It's kind of loosely related to this, but I'm seeing more talk and focus on privacy and less on security, which privacy is important, but they're not mutually exclusive. But it's almost like security is just like, it's going to happen, so we'll just write a check and we'll move on. Not understanding the debt we will have to pay because of that 5-10 years from now, which could be by way of bad actions and bad threat actors, state, foreign nations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the dangers, you're falling into sort of that nihilistic, thought process of, there's nothing we can do, and if that ends up the dynamic out there, yeah, you're going to see more things where they're looking to calculate with an insurer, what can we set as that threshold. And that is, I take it as an encouraging sign. I agree with you, Megan. I take it as an encouraging sign if the Department of Treasury is going to start to put some teeth in there to really do that. I'm somewhat curious to watch as SolarWinds evolves. They're a supplier to, I think it was 18,000 organizations total. 425 of the Fortune 500. That there's some significant impact to this, and the way in which it was undertaken. It's not new. I mean, we saw this in things like the Zombie Zero attack back in 2014, things like that. But the potential impact and secondary and tertiary effects of it, I would like to see that there's specific action taken. Going back to being the eternal optimist, I've also seen, if we look at our corporate boardrooms today, or even in the governance side and on the federal side, we're having discussions at a level that would have been unheard of, I think, 10, 15 years ago in most organizations. Some were certainly forward leaning, but a lot of companies certainly weren't doing that, and they are today. So I think we're seeing this elevated and the conversations taking place at the right levels. And I look at, nieces, nephews, coming behind us on the digital natives. They have a much more interesting understanding of sort of the potential impact and risk of the devices, the applications they use, things like that, which I thought, I find interesting talking to them about, what they will and won't do. And I see them bringing that logic and that thought process forward with them into their careers as they grow up.
Absolutely. And again, going back to the ability to test in the old days when I first got involved in security, if we went to do a physical security site assessment, we had a tool that would help us through that process to help us understand what were the priority items to look out for, and we could categorize that. And we could also show one critical infrastructure, say it was a power plant, we could show that power plant how they racked and stacked against other power plants in terms of security. And I do think that competition is a healthy motivator. People want to understand how their security ranks amongst their competitors. They want to understand if it's right-sized. Cybersecurity talent is hard to come by, right? So in many cases, you're relying off of your internal staff to say, this is good enough, or you're relying off of a controls framework like 62443 to tell you all the doors and ways that you should be locking the doors. But again, you don't have a good validation controls mechanism, verification and validation that the controls have actually come into play. And so in physical security, if you take that and you try to apply the same logic to OT, right, which in many cases is the convergence of the physical world and the IT world in a very real way, we don't have those options yet. And I know that it's very frustrating for owners and operators. You talk about owners of critical infrastructure. This may not be right, so someone can fact check me. But I had heard at one time that, who do you all think is the largest owner of critical infrastructure in the world?
Oh, it's got to be a telecom.
Is it?
I would say probably city government is probably water and waste related.
No. Undersea cables. Undersea cables have more physical volume than those things, right? So.
That's true.
I don't know that it's true, but again, you talk about OT environments. I had heard that it's the U.S. Department of Transportation.
Oh, that actually makes a lot of sense.
I could believe that. I could certainly believe that.
Yeah.
So when we talk about SCADA systems, control systems, ICS security that we're talking about there, yes, we're talking about assets that control bridges, that control maritime, that do tons of things. We're talking about stoplights. We're talking about all of the transportation infrastructure. So it is interesting, but when you look at an asset owner perspective, say maybe the U.S. Department of Transportation, what resources do they have available to understand and do that at scale, right? Because we're not physically conducting security assessments on IT, physical security side, and OT. If we had 1,000 people, we couldn't throw enough resources at that to scale, right?
Agreed. I think that's why it's more important for product owners, manufacturers to really bake that security in. So there's a level of trust in that product before we connect it in our environments. And that goes back to good manufacturing, product security labs, and ultimately maybe using simulators and emulators before you go into production.
And I do think we're seeing, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jacob.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, you were talking about this idea of like security nihilism, like this idea of like a breach is going to happen, so we'll just get our cyber insurance and move on. And I see that. I do see some of that. But I also think that there's an opposite side to that, which is, a security optimism where you constantly try to improve. And if you look at, especially on the IT side, some of these, like, some of the vendors are doing a really admirable job. Especially like if you look on the cloud security side, like what Amazon and Microsoft are doing to like secure their cloud environments, they take that shit seriously. And one of the ways they're able to take that seriously is that, they're doing offensive testing. They're relying on security research, whether internal or external, to do that continuous improvement.
Yeah, agreed.
And you can point to like the difference between Windows XP and Windows 10. Huge. That's light years difference that they've made with the operating system. Megan, going back to your comment on those being able to compare assessments so that you understand and leverage that competitive nature. I know the energy sector, and I think they used to have, and I can't remember the acronym. It was the E2CM2 or something, or E2C2 framework that Carnegie Mellon had helped kind of build out that allowed them to do that. They aggregated those results, and then you could kind of see where you sat in terms of each of the, and I think they used the resilience management model, or RMM, as the framework, but it was a subset of that. The other initiatives that I've seen, and actually the around sort of the Department of Transportation analogy, there's growing overlays that are being created with for NIST 853 for within the maritime industry, you're seeing those start to come evolve. We're at Rev 5. I think you're going to start to see more of them that are those industry specific that'll hopefully be able to provide that guidance to operators and asset owners out there.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking would be great maturity to see that evolution. But then at some point, is it overkill? If it's a PLC that only is supposed to go open, close, off, on, and I have more lines of code in the piece of firmware to do all the security detection. Now have we put security in front of the reason or the purpose of this product?
Where's the balance? Right.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep.
Totally. And I maybe I was leading you all to this, but I have a thought that I'd like you all to react to again, and that I have long been kind of categorizing engineering workstations and human machine interfaces, the products that traditionally sit at level 4, there where you have the human interaction, there where tons of data is being pulled into play, and they're also hyper connected, right? They're pulling and pushing data. And so with that, to me, if you were going to do a security assessment, especially in an automated way, I would seek to automate the security testing of level 4, if you could, because I cannot think of an attack on an ICS environment where an HMI has not been a pass-through for the attack. I call them it's a beachhead product, right? And that if you're an adversary, there's a chance it could be directly connected to the internet, which is a big, big no-no, but we see it happen, right? We see it happen with HMIs more so than we do PLCs based on the language that it's communicating in, right? Mm-hmm. It can accidentally become it can become directly connected to the internet, especially if someone, is trying to remote into a site or get diagnostics, that it has that heightened susceptibility, it has hyperconnectivity, but being able to kind of detonate, if you will, a malware and understand how it's going to propagate through level 4 and what else it's going to talk to, I think really helps prioritizing closing the doors, right? Because it's very tricky to understand what is talking to what in an OT environment, notwithstanding having to walk a plant floor in a process that could be wrought with human error, right? You want to understand the open ports and connections.
And when you say automate, is your mindset of more continuous monitoring or self-healing or mimic that environment in the control space, like a product security lab, using automation to test it?
Yeah, so I think it would blend a little bit into a way to automate finding the open ports, automating understanding how the threat is going to crash through your environment. What open doors is it going to go through first? If I had time with an asset owner and they were trying to understand where to prioritize their investments, that's where we would want to start, right? Is we would want to start with the obvious doors that you have open that you don't know about. And in many cases, the way to figure that out now is very manual, and people are having trouble scaling, especially if you look at data centers or other very large clients where there's multiple hundreds of sites globally, it's very difficult.
Well, I think some examples I've seen that seem to be working, and I'm not a cloud expert by any means, but to Jacob's point, I've seen the Microsoft ATP, the Advanced Threat Protection, and the Sentinel efforts where you bring those components, those workstations into that umbrella, and you have greater visibility on those workstations than I've ever seen. I've seen, you know, some of the dashboards, and it's super impressive. But I think, you know, when you step back and look, spear phishing still remains, you know, one of the fastest ways in there. And if that workstation is allowed to connect out, not having controls around that is a big issue. And if you don't have the discipline within that organization to establish those boundaries, that's probably the first issue. But yeah, some of what I've seen on the particularly with Microsoft Azure has been pretty impressive from my perspective.
Well, it looks like we have a question in from the audience. So Ben is asking, how do you think the trend of insurers using force majeure to escape paying out for major attacks will translate to ICS over time?
I've been watching a little bit of the discussion in the Discord about cyber insurance, waiting for a question on this. I think that cyber insurance is not a sustainable business model. I think that something's going to change.
From what angle? Not sustainable because
I mean, everyone gets hacked eventually, right? And that's not a reason for cyber nihilism. It's you know, it's a reason to do that continuous improvement. But I think that, you know, I am worried about whether or not cyber insurance can actually, you know, the concept of insurance is everyone collects to a shared or pays into a shared pool, and then it goes out to fix problems when they occur. If the cost of the problems is larger than what's getting paid in, then it's not sustainable, and that's the situation that I'm worried is happening.
I totally agree, and I have to make sure I say this in the same way.
To Ben's point, I think those companies will keep trying to do that until there's a point where the customers get too angry with them to continue, and then something's going to change.
I think seeing how insurers write policies with very little understanding or overview of how they're insuring the insuree is a problem. And you're right, 101 basics is if insurance company has to write more checks out than they collect premium for policies, then they're going to lose out. And now you're seeing that on the IT space that, right, you know, hey, you didn't have this in place, or you do an upfront broker call, and if you don't answer the questions that well, you may not get a policy, or you're going to pay a higher premium, or you're going to have a higher holdback, which is equivalent to a deductible. However, when we look at ICS side of the house, I think companies will still fare well getting the insurance payout because it's easier to tie that with the loss of something, be it loss of life, be it loss of product, and then insurance. I think there's probably more avenues to follow to recoup dollars in loss because of a technology fallout. I mean, even if it's non-security related and your plant goes down. But so I think that it will take the journey of IT, but have a little bit better success. But I think to your point too, Jake, that insurers probably need better understanding and better approaches to write the policies, or they're just throwing money in the wind.
Yeah, I agree with all of those points. And Brian, did you have anything to add on the force majeure? Because I think what he might be touching on is when something is declared an act of war, that they're not going to pay if this is considered an act of war.
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's been a lot of discussion, particularly as you look at solar winds and what is considered nation state level advanced persistent threat. They had the access, they had the sophistication, and they had the patience. When you read some of the detailed analysis of it, this took an enormous amount of effort. And you had one nation state apparently driving it. You had another that kind of slipstreamed in behind. But Laura Odell at the Institute for Defense Analysis uses the term gray zone competition. And I think what we're going to begin seeing is, short of armed conflict, this gray zone competition where it's a quasi nation state. They're using proxies. It's much muddier than I think. Very clear that from some of us, the Soviet bomber coming over, this isn't that clear cut anymore. And I think the argument can be made, you can't do that kind of exclusion, carte blanche the way they used to. So I do think this is going to change. And that's kind of why I'm curious to watch SolarWinds as the investigations conclude, as the secondary efforts get underway, what the determination is, both at the national level, what the administration decides to do in response, some of which we may never know, but some will certainly be public, perhaps indictments, from the U.S. Attorney's Office, things like that. So, I think that's a diminishing. That's certainly a diminishing returns on that language.
Great. Well,
given how many people are,
I'm sorry, Jake. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, given how much like talk this is generating, I think that there's a demand for an actual expert in this topic to talk about cyber insurance, because that'd be interesting to hear.
It would.
I love the whole force majeure topic. I mean, props to Ben for raising that. And it's amazing how quickly the time goes by on this panel, because I feel like I easily could sit here with you all till 6 p.m. tonight just chatting. Not because we're friends, well, we are, but because the topic is so rich in and of itself. So we're going to wrap up really quick. Any parting advice? Any hot takes? Corey, we'll start with you.
Oh boy.
Sorry.
No, nothing. I mean, I think it was a great conversation. I don't think there's anything new in my mind that would add to this conversation. So I appreciate being invited in, and great combo.
Thanks, Corey. Jake?
All right. If you're not doing offensive security testing or any sort of validations of assumptions in your OT environments, you should start. And if you're concerned about the dangers of that, you should ask your security team about passive reconnaissance. You can find out a lot just by looking at device MAC addresses and what traffic is being sent over a network. Really safe and easy way to start and get into validating some of those assumptions. That's it. That's my advice. That's my closing advice.
Brian?
No, I definitely appreciate the opportunity and enjoyed the conversation. I would offer, back to an earlier point on, this is occurring at the municipality level, at townships, if you're interested in getting involved, sit in on the township meeting. These are the folks making those decisions, those investment decisions for your community. See how that's being done and see what kind of influence you can offer as an information security professional out there.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you all so much. This has been a blast. I look forward to doing more of these in the future. Bryson, thanks so much for having us. I think it was great discussion. Again, we could go on forever, but just again, thank you. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. And Megan, as you and I have talked, we're going to have a lot more conversations about this over the year.
Yeah, I think it's clearly a need. I mean, the writing's on the wall on this one.
Well, thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
For the rest of
Thank you very much.
who want to learn more about